For 7 years, the people of Ashcombe believed Duke Harley Vincent carried a curse no physician in England could name. His wife had left him hollow, and when she died far from Blackthorn Manor under circumstances nobody could fully explain, the story finished itself in every kitchen and drawing room from London to the coast. He could not bear the touch of a woman, for proposals had come to nothing. 11 maids had packed their bags within a month and gone. His grand house sat behind its iron gates like something the county had quietly agreed to forget. Daisy Hodgson did not care what the village said. Her brother owed money to men who did not send polite letters when payment came late, and Blackthorn Manor offered nearly double what any respectable house in the county would pay a girl willing to stay past a fortnight. She walked through those gates with her whole future folded into one small bag, expecting silence, cold corridors, and a master who would never once look at her. She did not expect to find him alone in the library on her third night, staring at a fire he had let burn down to nothing, his hands trembling before she had even crossed the room. What Daisy Hodgson would learn about the Duke of Blackthorn over the months that followed would shatter every rumor the kingdom had built around him, and put her own heart in far more danger than her brother's debts ever had. Before we go any further, tell me something. Type in the comments which town, which city, which corner of this world you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and nothing makes a story feel more alive to me than knowing exactly how far it has traveled to reach you. If tales like this keep you watching past the hour you meant to stop, subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Subscribe to see how the next one unfolds, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I would truly love to say hello, just to know exactly how far our story has traveled to reach you. The letter from Blackthorn Manor arrived on a Tuesday, and Daisy Hodgson read it twice before she let herself believe it. Her father had been a bookkeeper, careful with other men's money and hopeless with his own, and when he died in the spring he left behind a modest house, a stack of unpaid bills, and a 17-year-old son who had inherited none of his caution. Michael Hodgson was clever and warm and utterly unable to say no to the wrong sort of men. Within 3 months of their father's funeral, he had borrowed against a debt that was not his to borrow against, from lenders in town who did not forget a name once it was written in their ledger. Daisy had gone to every respectable house within 30 miles looking for work. Each door had closed the same way, gently, and with some excuse about a cousin's girl already promised the position. She understood, eventually, that word of the Hodgson name and the Hodgson debts had traveled faster than she had. Blackthorn Manor wrote back within 4 days of her inquiry. The wages offered were nearly double what any housemaid in the county could expect, and Daisy was neither foolish nor proud enough to ask why. "You cannot go there," said Mrs. Ferris, who ran the bakery at the end of their lane and had never in her life kept an opinion to herself. "That house is cursed, girl. The Duke hasn't touched a woman in 7 years. Not his hand to a lady's glove at a dance, not so much as a bow that brings him within arm's reach. They say his wife did something to him before she died, something no doctor can undo. I need the wages, Mrs. Ferris. Every girl who's gone up there needs something when she starts. None of them stay to need it twice." Daisy thanked her for the warning and took the position anyway. She had 11 shillings to her name, 1 change of linen folded into her bag, and a brother whose kneecaps she intended to keep intact. A curse, whatever that word meant to the village, was not going to frighten her out of a wage that could save him. The carriage that carried her to Blackthorn Manor let her down at the edge of the drive, and the house rose out of the mist the way a cliff rises out of fog, all at once and larger than she had prepared for. Half the windows were dark. Ivy had crept up the east wing, and no one had bothered to cut it back. Daisy stood with her bag in both hands and thought, quite plainly, that a house this size ought to have more life in it than this. The housekeeper who opened the door had a face that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Page Miller," she said. "You'll be Miss Hodgson." "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs." Page led her through a stone passage that smelled of lamp oil and old smoke, past a kitchen where 2 servants stopped speaking the moment the door swung open, and up a narrow back stair. "You'll take the west corridor and the morning room," Mrs. Page said. "His Grace breakfasts alone at 8. You do not speak to him unless he speaks first, And you do not go past the locked door at the end of the east wing. Not after dark, not for any reason. May I ask why, Mrs. Page? The housekeeper considered her a long moment before answering. Because I have asked you not to, and that should be enough for a girl who wants to keep her position. Daisy set her bag down at the foot of a narrow iron bed and did not ask again, though the question sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe. She caught her first true look at the Duke 2 days later, crossing the long gallery with an armful of linens. He stood at the far end near a window, tall and dark-haired, dressed simply for a man of his rank, his jaw set in the particular stillness of someone who has trained himself not to react to anything. He did not look cursed. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix, and lonelier than any man surrounded by that much gold and stone had any right to be. It was 3 nights later that Daisy understood, for the first time, that the village might not have been exaggerating. A neighboring baroness had called that afternoon, all silk and perfume and determined charm, and stayed long enough that Mrs. Page set an extra place at supper. Daisy was carrying a tray past the drawing room when the baroness, laughing at something of her own invention, reached out and closed her gloved hand around the Duke's forearm. Harley Vincent went rigid as though he had been struck. The color left his face. His breath came fast and shallow, and for one unguarded second, Daisy saw something in his eyes that had nothing to do with pride or coldness or curses. It was fear, plain and total, the kind she had only ever seen in a cornered animal. He excused himself from the room before the baroness had finished her sentence. Daisy stood frozen in the corridor with the tray still balanced in her hands, and the question that had been sitting in her mind since her first night at Blackthorn Manor changed shape entirely. It was no longer whether the rumors were true. It was what, exactly, had been done to this man to make them true. The village had told Daisy that Duke Harley Vincent was cold. Within a fortnight, she had begun to suspect the village had never actually spoken to him. She saw the evidence in small places nobody else seemed to notice. A basket of coal left outside the widow Hastings' cottage every week without a note attached, though the whole village knew whose crest was pressed into the wax on the accompanying letter of credit at the grocer's. Daisy found the ledgers by accident, dusting a study she had not been asked to enter, and she closed the book at once, as though she had walked in on something private. She said nothing of it, but she began to watch Harley Vincent differently. At the servants' table one evening, Maya Lawrence, who had been at Blackthorn Manor longer than anyone but Mrs. Page, laughed over her stew about his lordship and his ghosts. "He won't so much as pass a woman his own gloves without setting them down first," Maya said. "Frightened of us all, I'd wager. Or of something worse. Perhaps he has reason to be careful," Daisy said, before she had decided to speak at all. The table went quiet. Maya raised an eyebrow. "Careful, is it? You've been here 2 weeks, Hodgson." "I've been here long enough to see him pay for a school he never sets foot in," Daisy said, and went back to her supper, and did not explain further, because she did not yet understand it herself. 2 mornings later, she found a new woolen cloak folded on the end of her bed, dark blue, well made, plainly not the sort of thing servants bought for themselves. There was no note. Daisy's old cloak had torn at the shoulder seam the week before, and she had mended it as best she could and said nothing to anyone about the cold that got through the tear on her walks across the grounds. She asked Mrs. Page about it. The housekeeper only said, "Some things in this house are best accepted without questions," which was not an answer at all, but told Daisy everything she needed to know about where the cloak had come from. That same week, Lord Kyle Vincent arrived at Blackthorn Manor without warning, his carriage rolling up the drive as though he owned every stone of it, which, Daisy would later learn, was closer to the truth than anyone liked to admit. He was Harley's cousin, several years younger, handsome in the easy, practiced way of a man who had learned early that charm opened doors that patience never would. He greeted the household staff by name, complimented Mrs. Page's roses, and made Maya laugh within the first 10 minutes of his arrival. He was, by every visible measure, a delight. Daisy did not trust him for a single moment. It was nothing she could have explained to anyone. It was the way his eyes moved over a room and settled, always, on whoever seemed to matter least, cataloging them the way a merchant catalogs stock. It was the particular warmth in his voice when he spoke to Harley, a warmth that never once reached his eyes. "Cousin," Kyle said over supper, loud enough for the staff to hear as they served, "you really must consider remarrying. A man in your position cannot go on alone forever. People do talk." "People have always talked, Kyle," Harley said quietly. "You've never needed my encouragement to add to it." Kyle laughed as though this were the finest joke he had heard all season, and reached over to clasp his cousin's shoulder. Daisy watched Harley go still in the particular way she now recognized, watched him hold his breath until Kyle's hand withdrew, and watched Kyle notice it too, and file it away behind his smile. She thought of a phrase her father used to say about certain men in his ledgers, men whose numbers never quite added up no matter how carefully you checked them. Something does not balance here. It was 3 nights after that supper, while dusting a locked cabinet in the unused east sitting room that Mrs. Page had forgotten to have cleared out, that Daisy's hand caught on a loose panel and a portrait slid free onto the floor. A woman looked back at her from the frame, beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, her painted eyes carrying an expression Daisy could not quite name. Amusement, perhaps, or contempt, dressed up to look like something softer. Daisy did not need to ask who she was. She had heard the name enough times in the village to know it on sight. Lady Mary Evans, the wife who had left and later died, and taken the whole truth of Blackthorn Manor with her, or so everyone believed. Daisy slid the portrait back behind its panel exactly as she had found it, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Manor, she found she could not stop thinking about a dead woman's face. Daisy heard the argument before she meant to. She had come to the study with a fresh tray of tea, and the door stood open a hand's width, enough for 2 raised voices to carry into the corridor. One belonged to Harley. The other, she recognized after a moment, belonged to Dr. Ben Doyle, the physician who called at Blackthorn Manor more often than any household without a sick person in it should require. "There is nothing wrong with you, Harley. Not in the way you think. Dr. Doyle's voice was tired, the voice of a man repeating himself for the 100th time. "I have examined you more times than I can count. Whatever this is, it isn't in your body." "Then tell me what it is, Ben, because I am done pretending I don't know what happens to me." Daisy should have retreated. She told herself so, later, many times. Instead, she stood very still with the tray in her hands and listened as Harley Vincent, Duke of Blackthorn, said aloud for the first time in Daisy's hearing the thing the whole county had been whispering about for 7 years, though none of them had ever gotten it quite right. "It isn't that I can't touch a woman, Ben. It's that when I do, I am 7 years younger and standing in my own dining room while Mary tells our guests, in front of the whole table, exactly what kind of husband I have failed to be. It's her voice I hear. It's her laugh. I know it isn't real. I know she's gone. My body does not seem to have received the news." There was a long silence. "That is not a curse, Harley," Dr. Doyle said finally, gently. "That is grief with nowhere to go, wearing the shape of fear because fear was easier for you to name than her cruelty. You are not broken. You have simply never been given the chance to heal." Daisy set the tray down on a side table in the corridor with hands that were not entirely steady, and walked away before either man could discover she had heard anything at all. She thought about it for 3 days before she said a word to him directly. It happened in the library, of all places, the same room where he had once frozen entirely at a stranger's touch. Daisy had come to return a book he had lent her, one on the cultivation of roses, a small kindness he had extended without explanation 2 weeks earlier after finding her admiring the neglected garden beds. "You read it," he said, surprised, when she handed it back. "Twice. I have opinions about your gardener, Your Grace." That earned her something close to a real smile, brief as a struck match. "Everyone has opinions about my gardener. He has opinions about himself that outpace them all." Daisy hesitated, and then decided that a woman who had walked into a cursed house for wages did not have much room left to be a coward. "I am not afraid of you, Your Grace. Whatever the village says." Something shifted behind his eyes, guarded and then, slowly, less so. "You should perhaps ask why the village says it before you decide that." "I already know why," Daisy said quietly. "I won't pretend I don't. But knowing why doesn't change what I see in front of me. And what I see is a man who pays for a school he'll never visit and left a cloak on a housemaid's bed rather than let her freeze, and who is kinder than 7 years of rumor has ever once given him credit for." Harley looked at her for a long moment, and Daisy understood that she had said more than a servant was meant to say to a duke, and did not take a single word of it back. "I will not ask anything of you that you are not ready to give," she told him instead, softer now. "Not trust, not closeness, nothing. But I would like, if you'll allow it, to keep bringing you books about roses, and to keep being someone in this house you don't have to brace yourself around." "Why?" he asked, and the question was not a challenge. It sounded almost afraid of its own answer. "Because everyone in Ashcombe decided who you were 7 years ago, and not one of them has bothered to check if they were right." Over the following weeks, something quiet grew between them that neither called by name. Daisy brought him books. He began, without quite meaning to, saving her a chair near the fire when the evening reports allowed her a few minutes' rest. They talked about roses, about her father's ledgers, about the schoolchildren whose warm room he funded and never visited because he could not yet trust himself around a room full of curious young faces who might reach for his sleeve without warning. It was in one such quiet evening, weeks into their strange and careful friendship, that Harley reached toward her hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, close enough that Daisy felt the warmth of his fingers a breath away from her own. He stopped himself an inch short and pulled back as though he had touched a flame. "I'm sorry," he said low. "Don't be," Daisy said. "An inch closer than last week is still closer." He looked at her as though she had handed him something he had not known he was permitted to want. Lord Kyle. He found Daisy in the market square on her half-day, bought her a cup of tea she had not asked for, and came to his point with the unhurried patience of a man who had done this before. "A woman in your position hears things, Miss Hodgson. Sees things. Nothing improper, you understand. Simply an observation here, a small detail there, about his Grace's habits, his moods, his health. There would be compensation, of course. Generous compensation." "You want me to spy on him," Daisy said flatly. "I want you to be sensible about your family's situation." Mr. Potter's smile did not waver. "I understand your brother's debts have grown rather serious of late." Daisy set down the tea she had not touched and walked away without another word, though her hands did not stop shaking until she was halfway home. She learned, 3 days later, exactly what Mr. Potter had meant. Michael's debt, which had stood at a bearable if painful sum when she'd first taken the position at Blackthorn Manor, had somehow doubled. The lenders who held it were, her brother wrote in a frightened, blotted letter, new men, ones who had bought up his notes from the old ones without explanation and now wanted payment faster than any honest arrangement allowed. Daisy did not need Mr. Potter to confirm who had purchased those notes. She had already begun to suspect the shape of Lord Kyle's game, and this only sharpened the outline. Fresh rumors began moving through the villages that same week, uglier and more specific than the old ones. Whispers that named Daisy directly now, that suggested things about her time alone in the library with the Duke that were not true and were designed, precisely, to make her too ashamed to stay. She told Harley none of it at first. She told herself she was protecting him. In truth, she was still learning how much of her own fear she was allowed to hand to another person. It was Mrs. Page who noticed first, catching Daisy's hollow-eyed exhaustion over the breakfast trays one morning and drawing the whole story out of her with the patient stubbornness of a woman who had raised 3 younger sisters on nothing but grit. "You'll tell him," Mrs. Page said when Daisy finished. "Not because he can fix it, because he deserves to know what it cost you to stay." Daisy told him that evening, in the garden, where the neglected rose beds had slowly become the one place in the house that felt entirely their own. She had expected caution from him, or worse, retreat. Instead, she watched something harden in his face that she had not seen before, something less like fear and more like the particular anger of a man who has finally identified an enemy worth being angry at. "Kyle," Harley said, not a question. "I can't prove it. Not yet." "You won't need to prove it alone." He was quiet a moment, looking at the roses rather than at her, which was, Daisy had learned, often how he managed his harder feelings. "I have let my cousin move through this house and this county for 7 years believing I was too broken to notice what he was doing. I think it is time I proved him wrong about that, at least." For the first time since Daisy had arrived at Blackthorn Manor, she heard him laugh, really laugh, at something small and foolish she'd said about his gardener's stubborn opinions on rose pruning, and the sound of it settled into her chest like sunlight after a long winter. It was 2 nights later that someone slipped a bitter powder into the feed of Harley's favorite horse, a gray gelding named Storm that he had raised from a foal. The animal survived only because the stable boy caught the smell in time and refused to let him near the trough. Harley stood in the stable long after the veterinarian had gone, one hand resting on Storm's neck, his jaw tight, with a fury Daisy had never once seen on him. "This was a message," he said quietly, when Daisy came to stand beside him. "Kyle wants me to know exactly how close he's willing to come. Then we make certain he learns exactly how close we're willing to come back," Daisy said, and meant every word of it. Harley told her the rest of it on a night when the rain kept them both indoors and the fire in the library burned low in gold. "Mary was clever," he began, staring into the flames rather than at Daisy, the way he did whenever the memory required more courage than the conversation. "Cleverer than anyone gave her credit for, myself included, for the longest time. She married me for the title and resented me for not being more than the title, and somewhere in the middle of that resentment, she decided the cruelest thing she could do to a man who loved her as foolishly as I did was to make him doubt he deserved to be loved at all." He told her of dinners where Mary had laughed at him in front of guests, of quiet cruelties delivered so smoothly that no one watching ever caught the blade beneath the smile, of a marriage that had worn him down inch by inch until touch itself had become tangled up with humiliation in some deep, wordless part of him that reason alone could not untangle. "And when she left," he said, "she made certain the story that followed her was that I had driven her away. That I was somehow lacking, somehow less than a husband ought to be. It was easier for people to believe than the truth. Her sister still repeats it," Daisy said quietly. "Lady Sarah. I've heard the servants speak of her visits. Sarah believes every word of it, because Mary told her every word of it. And Sarah has never once wondered why her sister needed an entire county to believe her husband was broken." Daisy did not reach for his hand. She had learned, by now, that the reaching had to come from him, when he was ready, and not a moment before. Instead, she said, simply, "You are not broken, Harley. I don't say that to comfort you. I say it because I have watched you for months now, and a broken man does not fund a school in secret or sit with a frightened horse until dawn or apologize to a housemaid for pulling his hand back an inch too soon." He turned to look at her then, and something in his face had gone very open, very unguarded, in a way Daisy had not seen since her very first glimpse of him across the long gallery. Slowly, without looking away from her, he reached out and closed his hand around hers. He did not flinch. He did not pull back. His fingers trembled, briefly, and then steadied, and Daisy felt the whole weight of 7 years settle and finally release in the warmth of that ordinary, extraordinary touch. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. There did not seem to be words equal to it. Mrs. Page, passing the library door with a stack of linens, caught sight of the two of them through the gap and did not interrupt. She only smiled to herself, the small, private smile of a woman who has waited a very long time to see a house come back to life, and continued down the corridor without a sound. "Stay," Harley said finally, his thumb tracing slow, careful circles over the back of her hand as though he still could not quite believe he was allowed to. "Not as my housemaid. Not because of wages or your brother's debts or anything that brought you here in the first place. Stay because I have not felt like myself in 7 years, and I feel like myself when you're in this room." "I'm not going anywhere," Daisy told him, and meant it with everything she had. Her father's training came back to her almost by instinct. Daisy had grown up watching him bend over columns of figures at their kitchen table long after her mother had gone to bed, teaching her, without either of them quite realizing it was a lesson, how a lie always left a mark somewhere in the numbers, even when it hid everywhere else. When Harley, half in jest, mentioned that the estate's accounts had grown harder to follow since his cousin had begun helping with certain arrangements, Daisy asked to see them. It took her 4 evenings, working by candlelight after her official duties were done, to find the first thread worth pulling. A series of payments, modest enough individually to escape notice, made from the estate's discretionary accounts to addresses in London that meant nothing to her at first. She traced them anyway, the way her father had taught her, cross-referencing dates against the household's other records, and found that each payment landed within days of a fresh wave of gossip about the Duke moving through Ashcombe and the county beyond. Lady Sarah Evans, Mary's sister, received the largest and most regular of these sums, disguised in the ledgers as payment for household linens that, as far as Daisy could determine, had never actually arrived at Blackthorn Manor. She brought her findings to Dr. Ben Doyle first, uncertain whether Harley could bear the full weight of the discovery without a steadier presence in the room. The physician went pale reading over her notes. "These dates," he said, tapping one column. "Harley, look at this one." He turned the ledger toward the Duke, who had come to sit with them once Daisy sent word she had something urgent to share. "This payment to Sarah went out 4 days before Mary's death was reported to us." For days before, Harley. The room went very quiet. "You think Kyle knew?" Harley said slowly. "Before any of us did. I think," Daisy said, choosing her words with care, "that your own fortune has been quietly paying to destroy your reputation for years, and none of us noticed because the money never looked like what it actually was." Harley sat back in his chair, and for a moment Daisy watched 7 years of grief reorganize itself into something closer to fury. The particular fury of a man realizing the wound he had spent years blaming himself for had been inflicted on purpose by someone still sitting at his own dinner table. "We need more than ledgers," Dr. Doyle said. "Kyle will call this coincidence, or forgery, or your own confusion. We need someone who can speak to what actually happened, not merely what the accounts suggest. Then we find that person," Daisy said, carefully, quietly, "before Kyle realizes we're looking." It was, of course, already too late for quiet. Lord Kyle found Daisy in the estate office 3 nights later, the ledgers spread across the desk in front of her, and though he said nothing about it directly, the look on his face told her plainly that he understood exactly what she had found, and exactly what it meant that she had found it. "You've made yourself very useful to my cousin, Miss Hodgson," he said pleasantly, in a voice that had lost all its earlier warmth. "It would be a shame if that usefulness came at too high a cost." "Is that a threat, my lord?" "It's an observation," Kyle said, and smiled the smile that no longer fooled her at all. "I find observations tend to be far more effective." He left without another word, but Daisy sat alone in the office long after he had gone, aware, in a way that settled cold and certain in her stomach, that the quiet part of their fight had just come to an end. Kyle moved fast, once he understood the ledgers had been found. Michael's letter arrived 2 mornings later, and Daisy read it standing in the corridor, her hands going numb around the paper. Her brother had been visited, he wrote, by men who made it very clear that his debt would be called in full, immediately, unless his sister was willing to sign a statement swearing that the Duke of Blackthorn had behaved improperly toward her and that his temperament remained, in her professional judgment as a servant of the house, dangerously unstable. The alternative, the men had explained to Michael quite plainly, was prison, and not a comfortable stay in it. Daisy brought the letter straight to Harley, her hands still shaking, and watched him read it twice before setting it down with a control that cost him visibly. "He would use your brother to destroy both of us," Harley said quietly. "I should have seen this coming years ago. You couldn't have. He built this slowly, over years, while everyone around him decided you were the broken one and never once looked at him." Within the same week, Mr. Lewis Potter produced a set of documents, official-looking and thoroughly fabricated, suggesting a history of instability that no honest physician's notes would ever support. Lady Sarah, whether from genuine belief or careful instruction, began telling anyone who would listen that the Duke of Blackthorn had grown unfit to manage his own estates, that a formal inquiry into his fitness ought to be raised before the county's noble families. Daisy stood at the center of it, aware that a single signature from her could save her brother and destroy the man she loved, and equally aware that the signature would be a lie built on top of every other lie Kyle had spent 7 years constructing. "I won't sign it," she told Harley, in the garden, among the roses that had become theirs. "Not to save Michael. Not for any price Kyle can name. Daisy, I mean it, Harley. Michael would never forgive me if I bought his freedom with your name, and I would never forgive myself for helping bury the truth you've spent 7 years being punished for." Harley took her hands then, both of them, steady now, no trembling left in the grip at all. "Then we don't hide from this any longer. Either of us." Carl built his whole plan on the belief that I was too afraid to fight back. It's time he learned how wrong he was. There was, even in the tightening danger of those days, one evening that made the whole household laugh despite itself. Mr. Lewis Potter, invited to a formal supper at Blackthorn Manor under the pretense of discussing estate matters, found himself seated beside Mrs. Page, who spent the better part of 2 courses asking him increasingly specific and increasingly unanswerable questions about the exact provenance of his forged documents, phrased so innocently that he spent half the meal in visible sweating confusion before excusing himself early, to the poorly hidden amusement of every servant carrying a dish that evening. A little cruelty in a good cause, Mrs. Page said afterward, entirely without remorse. Never hurt anyone who deserved it. It was Lord Kyle himself who arrived at Blackthorn Manor 4 days later, no longer bothering with charm, demanding in front of the assembled household that Harley formally cede control of the estate, pending a full inquiry into his fitness to hold it. Harley met him at the top of the great staircase, Daisy standing beside him, and said only, "Come to the drawing room Thursday next, Kyle. Bring anyone you like. I have something to show the both of you." The drawing room at Blackthorn Manor had not held so many people in 7 years. Every noble family within 30 miles who had ever whispered about the cursed Duke arrived that Thursday, drawn by curiosity as much as concern, and found seats arranged in careful rows facing the fireplace, where Harley stood with Daisy at his side and Dr. Ben Doyle waiting quietly near the door. Lord Kyle arrived last, with Mr. Lewis Potter carrying a leather case of documents and Lady Sarah seated near the front, already dabbing at her eyes in practiced anticipation of the sympathy she expected to receive. Kyle spoke first, smooth and confident, presenting his fabricated evidence to the assembled families with the easy authority of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything in his life. He spoke of instability, of a household run by rumor and secrecy, of a duke too fragile to be trusted with the responsibilities of his own name. When he finished, Daisy stepped forward. She had spent 3 nights preparing what she would say, and every word of it came out steady, because she had stopped being afraid of this room the moment she understood what was actually at stake in it. She laid the original ledgers on the table before the assembled families, page by page, showing the true payments beneath the false ones Kyle had used to disguise them, showing the dates that lined up with each wave of cruel gossip, showing the sum paid to Lady Sarah days before news of Mary's death had even reached Blackthorn Manor. "Ask yourselves," Daisy said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed room, "why a man's own cousin would need to pay for rumors about him, if those rumors were already true." Dr. Ben Doyle spoke next, confirming plainly, before every family gathered, that in 7 years of examination he had never once found evidence of the illness the county had invented for their duke, only the aftermath of a cruelty no one had bothered to look closely enough to see. It was Lady Sarah who broke first, flustered under the weight of so many eyes, defending her sister's memory with a detail about the timing of Mary's death that no one outside the family should have known, a slip that told the whole room, plainer than any ledger could, exactly how deep her involvement ran. Mr. Lewis Potter, watching his own forged documents dissolve into worthlessness in front of the very families he had hoped to impress, did the only thing his particular kind of courage allowed. He turned on Lord Kyle entirely, offering every detail of the scheme in exchange for his own protection, his voice tumbling out faster with each passing second as the room's mood shifted decisively against the man he had served. Kyle's composure did not survive the betrayal. What followed was ugly and undignified. A man who had spent 7 years building an elegant lie now shouting accusations that convinced no one, because the truth in the room by then was simply too well documented to argue with. The noble families who had spent 7 years pitying, avoiding, and quietly mocking Duke Harley Vincent now looked at him with something else entirely. Something closer to shame at how easily they had believed the worst of a man who had only ever needed someone to look past the rumor to the wound beneath it. Harley turned to Daisy in front of every one of them, and reached for her hand without a flicker of hesitation, without a single tremor, his fingers closing around hers as naturally as if 7 years had never happened at all. The room went utterly silent. Then, From somewhere near the back, an elderly baroness began, quietly, and then not so quietly, to applaud, and the sound spread through the drawing room like sunrise breaking over the moor. The magistrate's men came for Lord Kyle Vincent within the week, the evidence too thorough and too public by then for any family connection to soften the fall. Fraud, extortion, the attempted poisoning of a horse that very nearly killed a stable boy along with it, and conspiracy to destroy a peer's reputation and estate through years of deliberate cruelty. The charges, once listed in full before the county court, left no room for the sympathy Kyle had once known so well how to command. Mr. Lewis Potter's cooperation bought him a lighter sentence than his forgeries deserved, though not light enough to spare him several years he would spend regretting the particular price of easy money. Lady Sarah lost every privilege her noble birth had once guaranteed her, cast out by families who could no longer pretend not to have heard her slip that Thursday afternoon. Her sister's memory finally, permanently stripped of the sympathy it had traded on for 7 years. Michael Hodgson repaid every shilling of his debt over the following year, working alongside the estate's steward at Blackthorn Manor and proving himself, slowly and honestly, worthy of the trust his sister had never once stopped extending him. Maya Lawrence found Daisy in the corridor one evening, twisting her apron in her hands, and offered an apology for every unkind word she had ever said about the Duke, plainly and without excuse, which Daisy accepted just as plainly, because grudges had never suited her half so well as second chances did. It was in the restored rose garden, weeks later, under a sky gone soft and gold with early evening, that Harley knelt before Daisy among the very roses they had spent so many careful evenings tending back to life, and asked her to be his wife, not as a duke offering a title, but as a man finally, fully free to want something for himself. Daisy said yes before he had even finished the question, and the laugh that followed, bright and unguarded, was the same laugh Mrs. Page had first caught through the library door months before, grown now into something that filled the whole house. Blackthorn Manor celebrated that night, with music spilling from open windows and dancing on the terrace and laughter carrying clear across the moor, the first true celebration the house had seen in 7 long years, and everyone within its walls, family and staff alike, understood they were watching something more than a happy ending. They were watching a household finally, completely, come back to life. They were married in the spring, before tenants and servants, and the same noble families who had once whispered about a cursed duke, and now could not stop speaking of the maid who had saved him. Daisy became Duchess of Blackthorn without ever losing the particular directness that had first caught Harley's attention across a library table stacked with books about roses. She walked the estate's grounds the same way she always had, sleeves ready to be rolled up, opinions ready to be shared, and the tenants who had once eyed the great house with quiet dread began, slowly, to speak of it as somewhere they might actually be welcome. Together, the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorn opened a free school large enough for every child on the estate, not merely the handful Harley had once funded from a careful distance. They established a small medical clinic under Dr. Ben Doyle's direction, and an apprenticeship program that gave young men like Michael Hodgson, who had once seen only debt and desperation ahead of him, an honest trade and an honest future. Michael became the estate's steward in time, trusted with figures far larger than the debts that had once threatened to bury him, and never once forgot the sister who had walked through a cursed house's gates to save him. Mrs. Page Miller stayed on for years after, ruling the household with the same closed ledger face she had always worn, though those who knew her well noticed she smiled a great deal more than she once had, especially on the evenings she found the Duke and Duchess laughing together over something small and foolish in the library. Harley never again flinched from Daisy's touch, not once, not in all the years that followed. What Dr. Doyle had told him that difficult night in his study proved entirely true. He had never been broken. He had only needed patience and honesty, and someone willing to see past 7 years of rumor to the man underneath it. Blackthorn Manor, once spoken of only as the home of the cursed Duke, became known in time across the whole county as something else entirely, a house that had somehow turned grief into a school, cruelty into a clinic, and fear into a love story every mother in Ashcombe eventually told her daughters, usually beginning with the words, "Now, this one is true." Years later, on a warm afternoon thick with the smell of roses in full bloom, Harley and Daisy stood together at the edge of that same garden and watched their children run laughing between the flower beds their parents had once tended by candlelight, in the exact place where fear had finally, fully, given way to hope. A word before you go. There is a kind of wound the world likes to call a curse, simply because it cannot see it and cannot be bothered to look closer. Harley Vincent was never broken. He was hurting, quietly, for 7 long years, while an entire county decided it was easier to whisper about him than to ask what had actually happened to him. If this story leaves you with one thing, let it be this. What looks like coldness from a distance is very often pain that has never once been given the safety to heal. Look closer at the people around you before you decide you already know their story. Thank you for staying with Daisy and Harley all the way to the Rose Garden. If their story found its way into your evening, I would love for it to keep finding you. Subscribe to see how the next one unfolds, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I would truly love to say hello, just to know exactly how far our story has traveled to reach you. Until the next one, take care of yourselves, and of the people whose stories you have not fully heard yet.